Reach high, for stars lie hidden in you. Dream deep, for every dream precedes goal. Quote and unquote, Rabindranath Tagore. Good morning to one and all present here. On behalf of Ethiraj College for Women, Postgraduate and Research Department of English, I take immense pleasure in welcoming you all to Athena 2122, where minds meet. Athena 21, an annual literary event of English department, ensures that the students of English department showcase their potential. With pleasure, I invite you to yet another year of literary engagement in the realm of knowledge. The birth of contemporary literature has not only allowed us to become rational thinkers by reflecting on where we, as a society, are on the basis of social and political standing, but has also played a major role in illuminating the strength and deepness of the faith. This year, our annual literary event, Athena, focuses on contemporary Indian literature as a theme to honor the works of writers, artists, poets, and creators of the contemporary era. Today, we are very much delighted to have a contemporary Indian writer as a guest of honor amidst us. With the blessings of our goddess Athena's wisdom, let us invoke the blessings of God Almighty. Let us raise for the invocation.
महागणपतिम् श्रीमहागणपतिं मनसा स्मरामि महागणपतिं मनसा स्मरामि वसिष्ठवामदेवादिवन्दितमहागणपतिम् महादेवसुतम् महादेवसुतं गुरुभुवनुतं महादेवसुतं गुरुभुवनुतं मारकोटि प्रकाशं शान्तं मारकोटि प्रकाशं शान्तं महाकाव्यनाटकादिप्रियम् महाकाव्यनाटकादिप्रियं सुगवाहनमोदः प्रियं महागणपतिम् श्रीमहागणपतिं मनसा स्मरामि वसिष्ठवामदेवादिवन्दितमहागणपतिम्.
Thank you, Nivedita. May I now request Dr. J. Mangekarasi, Associate Professor and Head, Department of English, AD, to deliver the welcome. Over to you, ma'am.
Pleasant morning to one and all present here. I quote and unquote, the height of our accomplishment equals the depths of our conviction. It's not an easy task to sustain a tradition of a practice without an indefatigable conviction. I look at Athena, the literary event of the English department, as one such tradition that has helped us Ethirajians believe in the strength of conviction. We look forward to the event every year as it provides us an opportunity to meet great stalwarts in the field of literature and broadens our understanding of the world around us. I extend a warm welcome to the chairperson, principal, vice principals of both aided and self-supporting, faculty members and our fraternity members, I'm extremely happy to welcome the guest of honor for today, Ms. Arundhati Subramaniam, contemporary Indian poet and Sahitya Academy winner. Thank you, ma'am, to have accepted our invitation, taking time for us to join this event. I have no doubt that this program will be an enlightening session for all of us. I once again welcome you all to this inaugural of Athena 21-22. I wish the staff in charge of association for this year and student representative Anupriya Babu, Amudini, Trinita, Dharini, Ashwini Rajnikant, Darshini, Arundhati, and Ramya. Best wishes. Over to Dr. Ramana.
Thank you, ma'am. May I now request Dr. B. Priyadarshini, Assistant Professor, Department of English, aided, to introduce our guest of honor for the day, Madam Arundhati Subramaniam. Over to you, Priya.
Good morning. I deem it a great privilege to introduce our guest of honor for Athena 2021, Ms. Arundhati Subramaniam. Ms. Arundhati Subramaniam is one of the finest poets in India today, and any study on contemporary Indian literature would be incomplete without her poetry. Having authored 13 books of poetry and prose, she continues to explore the deep crevices of human psyche and culture through her works. Notable poetry collections of hers include Where I Live, When God is a Traveler, and Love Without Poetry. For her, in her own words, I quote and unquote, poetry is the art of murmured voice, a reminder of the magic whisper, the sorcery of the hushed voice, and allows her to inhabit a moment more fully. Her poems embody this deep magical quality as felt in her elegant writing style, an extraordinary imagination which recasts mundane experiences into exquisite moments of remembrance. As a poet and a seeker who has constantly been drawn towards the sacred and the spiritual, she consciously explores the dynamics of Indian spirituality. Her recent work, Women Who Wear Only Themselves, provides a glimpse into the sacred journeys of 4 women travelers. She has also edited a book of Bhakti poems titled Eating God. She has worked over the years as a performing arts curator, critic, and poetry editor, and divides her time between Mumbai, Chennai, and New York. Widely anthologized and translated, she has been invited to many international poetry festivals and conferences in the US, UK, Turkey, Italy, Spain, Israel, Australia, China, and Holland. Her works have been translated into several languages, including Tamil, Hindi, Italian, German, French, and Spanish. She was awarded the prestigious Sahitya Academy Award for her poetry collection, When God is a Traveler, which was also the season choice of the Poetry Book Society and was shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize in 2015. She has won several national and international awards that include the Kushwant Singh Award, the Mystic Kalinga Award, and Il Seppo Award in Italy. She was also the recipient of the Charles Wallace Fellowship and Homi Bhabha Fellowship. Ma'am, it's indeed an honor to have you with us today. Without further ado, I would like to invite Ms. Arundhati Subramaniam to take over.
Can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
I can be. Okay. I just want to say thank you. I thank you, Priya, for that introduction, and thank you to all the Ethirajians for having me here this morning. I would have loved to actually be there present physically present amongst you today, because in many ways, poetry for me is the art of intimacy. It's the art of sharing that is so integrally enhanced by physical presence. I would love to feel that we're sitting around the same campfire, as it were, and having this conversation. But since that's not possible, I'm glad to at least say that I'm in the same city. And I'm very glad that at least that has happened today, that convergence has been possible. I'm going to just start by sharing a poem with all of you, because I think I always feel like much less of an imposter when I'm actually reading poems and not simply talking about them. So it feels right today to start with a poem about Chennai, the city that I have never quite inhabited as a resident, but it's the city that I associate with summer holidays to my grandparents. And maybe it's because I've always lived in Bombay, which is this gritty, difficult, catastrophic city in its own way. I've never been lyrical about Bombay, but Chennai, perhaps because I associate it with vacations, has been a city that I can sometimes allow myself to sound lyrical, at least in flashes about. So here's Madras, which is the city that I knew growing up. I was neither born nor bred here, but I know this city of casuarina and tart mango slices, gritty with salt and chili and the truant sands of the marina, the powdered grey jowls of film heroes, my mother's sari, hectic with moonlight, still crackling with the voltage of an M.D. Ramanathan concert, the flickering spice root of tamarind and onion from Mylapore homes on summer evenings, the vast opera of the Bay of Bengal, flambéed with sun. And the language is intimate as the taste of sarsaparilla pickle, the recipe lost, the sour cadences as comforting as home. It's no use. Cities ratify their connections with you when you're looking the other way, annexing you through summer holidays, through osmotic memories of your father's glib lie to a kindergarten teacher, my mother is the fair one, and the taste of coffee one day in Lucca, subtly awakening an old prescription, Peabury, Plantation A, and 50 grams of chicory from the fragrant shop near the Kapalishwara temple. City that creeps up on me just when I'm about to affirm world citizenship. So that's my Madras poem. And in many ways, it implicates themes that I think have been constant in my work. Themes of belonging, of home, and of course, more recently, of journeys as well, but we'll come to that in a moment. What I would really like to talk to you about today, and I hope this will actually set off a conversation amongst us that can later be continued someday offline. What I'd really like to talk to you about today is about the whole business of writing poetry itself. Because it's always amazed me, especially when I speak to students, college students, it's always amazed me how many young people write poetry. Not all of them write fiction. Not all of them write essays, unless they meant they have to and are compelled to by their curriculum. But everyone, almost everyone, has written one poem at some point in their lifetimes, usually sometime in their teens. There's almost no one who hasn't written at least one passionate love poem or grief poem or rage poem. That's the nature of the emotional thermostat at that time in one's life. Any extreme situation, a moment of extreme, intense feeling, seems to, in some strange way, drive us to poetry. Why is it then, this is the question that I want to really talk about today, why is it then that so few of us actually continuers of poetry. It's quite amazing how many of us write poetry at some time in our lives, but we very seldom go out and buy books of poetry. Almost every adult that I know, and I hope that the young people who are listening in won't be amongst those, but think about how many times when you're on a holiday, when you're on your way to when you're at a train station, when you're at an airport, books up a book of poetry. Almost always people pick up a novel. They pick up fiction, something that's easy to read. And this strikes me as distinctly odd because all of us have in fact written a poem. Why then are we not readers of poetry? So my question today is really, why poetry? It's a question that I'm often asked, and I have been asked. It's a question that I have sometimes asked myself. There is no rational reason to be writing poetry. For those of you who were wondering whether this is something you can make a livelihood, a living out of, I'd say a reason. Poetry doesn't bring in publishers easily. It doesn't bring in buyers. You know that. I don't know how many of you are actually buyers of poetry. It doesn't necessarily bring in droves of readers. It certainly does not bring in royalty checks. And there is even an American survey that claims that poets die sooner than other species of writers. So really the odds are stacked against poetry. Why poetry? That's the question I want to look at today. And I'd like to share with you just 5 moments in my own life that have been pivotal in a sense. They're moments that have changed the way in which I looked business of writing poetry. And I'm just going to share those 5 moments and then perhaps conclude with a couple of readings and we can have a conversation. I'm going to start with the very first moment, which happened sometime around the time that I was about 3, I think. As a child, I grew up in Bombay or Mumbai or Bombay. It's a city of many names and many faces. It's a multilingual city. I grew up with Tamilian parents, but they didn't have a unidimensional inheritance either. My mother's parents were in Burma. She'd lived in Delhi. So I grew up with Tamil and Hindi. And because we had a cook from Kerala, there was Malayalam in the house as well. There was English. My parents were second-generation English speakers. And there was the city of Bombay with its great, crazy polyglottal mix of Hindi, Bombaya Hindi, and Marathi and Gujarati. So at the time that I was just emerging as a child into this world of language, I really didn't know where one language ended and another began. I couldn't have told you where Hindi ended and Tamil began because I didn't know. And all I did know at that age was that there were 2 kinds of language: the language of poetry and the language of prose. How did I know this? And I'll tell you how. The way I heard grown-ups speak when they spoke to each other, this was that distant, remote world that I never quite understood. But when I heard them speak, language seemed to walk. It seemed to be pedestrian, stodgy, functional, transactional language. It was the language they spoke to communicate things to each other. Whereas the language of poetry, at least when I heard nursery rhymes in English, or nonsense verse in Hindi, or bits of doggerel in Tamil, when I heard these languages, when I heard poetry in any of these languages, I just had glimpses, very fragmentary glimpses of meaning. But most of me was not meaning at all because in any case, I knew what was going on. Most of the time, what enthralled me was sound, was rhythm, was playfulness, was joy. I just felt the exuberance of language when it was in poetry. I still remember the first time that I heard Edward Lear's The Owl and the Pussycat. I don't know how many of you know the poem. It starts with the owl and the pussycat went to sea on a beautiful pea-green boat. They took some honey and plenty of money wrapped up in a 5-pound note. Now, did I understand what was going on? Did I really believe that an owl and a cat could go off on a pea green boat and take a 5-pound note? Obviously not. This was the realm, it was clear to me that this was the realm of a kind of parallel reality, of nonsense, where we didn't have to conform to all the rigid rules of common sense that I was told prevailed in the adult world, in the daytime world. This was a magical, parallel, nocturnal world where sense could be turned on its head. So my earliest recollection, which is the moment I want to share with you, was this insight, which I couldn't have articulated, but which I was dimly aware of in the kind of inarticulate way that children are aware of things. I knew that poetry was a place where language behaved differently, where meaning did, but it was not paramount. I realized that poetry was language that danced. Prose, at least the way adults spoke it, was language that walked. But poetry was kinetic language. It was language that could be here and there the next moment. It could leap in a way that prose couldn't. It was language that was capable of velocity and motion and rhythm. This was language as dance. That's today when I often do workshops with younger people and we talk about it, the question that invariably comes at some point is, but can I really write poems? Can I really read poems? Because I don't quite understand them. I'm almost afraid of them. And I want to say to those young people, as I would like to say to you today, do you remember the time when you were just like me, around 3 or 4, when really mental to your life, but you were capable, as I believe almost every one of us is, capable of responding exuberantly to language in motion. Everyone is capable of responding to that. Meaning is incidental. Language as sound, first moment I want to share with you. The second moment happened when I was about 12 or 13. I think I was right here, in fact, in this very home that I'm in now, visiting my grandparents when this apartment block was a house. And I remember standing lined with books, my grandfather's books, and I pulled down a book by someone called T.S. Eliot. I had no clue who T.S. Eliot was, whether this was a man or a woman, which part of the world he or she came from. And I opened the book to a page which spoke of a poem called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Now, I had no clue who J. Alfred Prufrock was either, but I started reading. And I mentioned this moment because this was pivotal for me, again. It was the moment when I realized to be there was a sense of homecoming. This is where I wanted to be. I felt invited, even though I didn't understand what was happening. If I had to stand up in class and say, this is what the poem is about, if I had to decode the poem, if I had to paraphrase the poem, I would have been wordless. But I knew the point that I want to make. The fact is that many of us, intuitive level, we know poetry even before we decode it, even before we understand it. We know, we have grasped a poem. We have recognized a poem even before we can paraphrase it. And that's because poetry is a kind of dance, but it's also a kind of music. One may not understand the mathematics of the music. One may not understand the ragam. One may not understand the talam, but one is capable of responding to music. Understanding the raga, the tala, all of that can add layers to your understanding, to your love of music. And those layers are wonderful and hugely useful. But the capacity to respond is something that we are all gifted with. And this again is something I want to say, and I want to emphasize to all of you, because in school, at the very same time that I was reading T.S. Eliot in my grandparents' home, I was in school being asked questions to which I would have no answers. There were certain teachers, not all of them, thankfully, but there were certain teachers in school who would ask us to read a poem, which I would love. I loved the act of actually speaking it aloud, saying it aloud, tasting it on my tongue. I loved the idea of crunching into words. There was that sensuous excitement about poetry. But as soon as I was asked this question, what is the poet trying to say? It would instill this great terror in my heart because I had no clue what the poet was trying to say. I just knew I wanted to be there. I just knew I was enjoying it, but I had no clue what the poet was trying to say. And so even while I loved T.S. Eliot, and even though I knew I wanted to be in that book and bury myself deep in its rhythms and its sounds and its cadences, I had no clue what it was trying to say. And it was much later that I realized that this is really a tyrannical question. What is lies that the poet cannot simply say what he or she is trying to say? There is a difference between saying something and trying to say something. As soon as you suggest to someone that the poet is trying to say something, you immediately, there is the poet who's trying desperately to grunt out little pellets of meaning, but can't quite succeed, and so does it in fragmentary bits of verse. You, in your superior wisdom as a student, can decode it and render it in flowing and eloquent prose paragraphs. And then, of course, there's the examiner in his or her superior wisdom who will then grade you. Who is at the bottom of the heap of this hierarchy? The poet. The poet who is trying to say what only you have understood he is trying to say. So this strikes me as fundamentally flawed because it sets up this divide that I think never leaves us in all our lives after that. This divide between form. The implicit assumption is that the only thing that counts in a poem is its content, is its meaning. And that meaning is meant to be extracted from the poem, out raisins from a bun. I'm sorry, the connection seems to be iffy, and I'm just assuming that I can be heard, and I'm going to continue. So this assumption that sound and sense are two separate categories, this assumption that form and content are two separate categories, that sociology and sensuousness have to be polarized, that they can never come together. This, I think, is responsible for our innate fear of poetry. We are taught to believe that we cannot love that which we do not understand. But if I were to invite each of you to think of all the things around you that you love, it could be music, it could be a person, and it could sometimes be a poem. You'll almost always find that the people, the things, the animals, what have you, the plants, how much do you really understand them? It's their surprises, their unpredictability, the uncertainty of these relationships in many ways that is what really draws us to them. So I want to remind you of the fact that I think we all know this, but we are encouraged to forget that meaning is just one small part of a poem. Poetry is language that dances. Poetry is also language as music. Randall Jarrell, the American poet and critic, once said that it's not that people have stopped reading modern poetry because they find it difficult. He says it's because we've stopped reading modern poetry that we find it difficult. And I think there's a very deep insight here. We're encouraged to be intimidated very often by poems. On the other hand, if we simply allowed ourselves to marinate in poetry, to read at will, read wildly, we'd find we actually understand more than we might suppose, more than we can even articulate. And that brings me to the third moment that I want to share with you. So I'm moving from poetry as verbal dance to poetry as verbal music. And the third moment I want to share with you is actually more of a phase than a single moment. It happened through my 20s. And it's the phase when I recognized that poetry is also craft. And craft is not a dirty word. This was a very important realization for me. It's very easy, particularly when one is at a certain age, you feel you want to write poetry because you have so much to say. You're full of rage and grief and passion and joy, and you want to transcribe all the crests and troughs and the pinnacles and the deep depth, the great depths that you plumb in your interior emotional life. You want to transcribe all of that on the page. So poetry becomes a desperate kind of self-expression, which is what it was for me. But it took me time to realize that everything that I transcribe on the page is not necessarily a poem. That a poem is also about form. A poem is also about the actual act of rolling up your sleeves and getting down to understanding the substance, that absolutely mercurial, unpredictable substance called language. So the third phase of my life, I was actually part of a writers group called the Poetry Circle in Mumbai. Mumbai in many ways was a city of poets. Though it is a commercial city, I now look back and I realize that there were many poets in the city that I inhabited. And so I had the fortune of being acquainted with some of them, and later I got to know many others. So mine was the city of Nissim Ezekiel. It was the city of Dom Moraes, of Dilip Chitre, of Adil Jassawala, of Giv Patel, of Eunice D'Souza, who was my professor in Xavier's, and Imtiaz Dharkar. And there was also this group that I was part of, a writers group, a young group of poets. And we'd meet once a fortnight. We'd travel all the way in this crazy city of Mumbai, travel great distances to reach the southernmost tip where we'd all meet. We'd convene at Nissim Ezekiel's headquarters, the PEN, and we'd sit and discuss poetry. We'd read our work. We'd argue feverishly about each other's work. Sometimes our friendships foundered entirely because we were capable of being ruthless, capable of being, I think, sometimes needlessly cruel. But the one good thing that came of it was that it compelled all of us to take poetry as craft seriously. This was for me what I call my period of apprenticeship. Because when you're looking for your own voice as a poet, you go through periods of imitation. So I went through periods when I tried to sound like those poets whom I admired, unconsciously sometimes consciously. I wanted to sound like someone else. And frequently, I forgot how I sounded. I sometimes went through periods of what I call séance, when I was channeling other voices, but I really couldn't hear my own. And I went through periods of what I often call ventriloquism, where other people seemed to have written poems that I was meant to have written. It seemed completely wrong, and I would seethe in indignation and in envy that they had got there before I had. How could they write the poem that I was supposed to have written? And of course, there were periods of complete laryngitis. These were periods when I had no voice at all. I didn't know what I wanted to write. I didn't even know if I wanted to write. All these phases are almost integral to any artistic journey. Almost integral. There's no escaping them, which is why I'm kind of telling you about them right away. Should you actually become a writer, these are inevitable phases. And yet when you look back, you realize all of it, the productive phases, the fallow phases, the desperately searching for your voice phases, all these are part of growing into yourself. And so I made all kinds of discoveries about language as chemistry. I realized that if you apply great heat and pressure to language, its chemical properties change. I realized that if you throw language up in the air and turn a spotlight on it, pull it out of a newspaper even, and toss it into another domain, it turns performative. There are all kinds of poems that for me became reminders of this. I realized poems were not always written, they could sometimes be found. I realized that there were many ways in which you could alter the pH value of language. So this was a time of great discovery. I won't stand by all the poems that I wrote in this phase, but it was a time of great discovery. Discovering poetry, not just as self-expression, but poetry as craft. And that brings me to my fourth point that I want to make. And that was the discovery of poetry as politics. A journey that led me to the realization that poetry is always a satyagraha. It's a non-violent resistance that you have to wage, a protest movement of its own kind. It's a satyagraha against ready-made language. What do I mean by ready-made? Is hurling ready-made language at you. It could be what I spoke of earlier, what I considered to be grown-up language as a child, which is just using language as I felt grown-ups often did around me, just to communicate. There was no attention to tone, to beauty, to nuance. It was essentially to say, I want to get to the driver. I want to get here. Can I order myself? Can I book a ticket? Whatever. But this was transactional language. This is one kind of ready-made language. There is another kind of ready-made language. There's the language of the slogan. There's the language of the political slogan. There's the language of the billboard. There's the language of advertising. There's the language of journalism. There's the language of the news anchor at 9. Ready-made language is coming at us from every direction. Language is hardening around us even as we speak. And so the great challenge for the poet is really to wrest something green, something new and fresh from this language that is hardening into cliche every moment around us. And there are many ways in which language can be political. Many people believe that being political only means raising your voice. Sometimes you can drop your voice and make a very radical political statement. So the way in which you adjust the volume of your utterance, the way in which you adjust the tone of your utterance, you can choose, as I said, I think in the introduction, this is what Dr. Priyadarshini mentioned as well. I have often spoken of poetry as the murmured voice. Sometimes you can raise your voice and sometimes you can actually choose to murmur. And you can still make a political comment. It is, of course, politics is also about what you say. It's about how you say it, and it's also about what you say. What are you choosing to say? What are you choosing not to say? I remember as a young student, when I first read Robert Frost, I realized the importance of actually speaking as he does, as many of you know, speaking of the forest, speaking of a tree. It was the first time I realized that that could be a political statement. Because he's choosing not to speak of an urban industrialized landscape. Choosing to affirm something else is in itself a political statement. Today, of course, we realize that actually speaking of those trees is deeply part of an eco-ethical statement that many of us might seek to make, because these are now burning issues for us today. So I have a rant of poem that I would love to read if there was time, and maybe there will be at the close of this session. But I have a poem addressed to a Welsh critic. And it's not just it's a poem that I would consider to be my overt political poem. I wrote it simply because I was addressing a Welsh critic here, but I could just as well be addressing any of the commentators back home right here in India, who tell us that there is only one way to be ourselves. All those voices that legislate on identity, that tell us that there is only one way to belong to a certain gender, only one way to belong to a particular community, to a particular faith. All those voices that seek to iron out diversity. So I have one rage poem to this cultural gatekeeper. And I think this is one possible way of responding to gatekeepers. Sometimes you have to turn into a gatekeeper yourself. At other times, you might exercise your politics differently. The world will hurl definitions at you. You can exercise a political choice by choosing your own definition. So I have a poem, for instance, where I say, okay, let me speak about my tribe. Maybe your tribe is this particular faith. Maybe your tribe is this particular gender. Maybe your tribe is this particular country. My tribe, at least in this, is all those children who've ever carried orange lunchboxes to school. My tribe is all those who choose to drop their voices. My tribe is those who choose to talk to plants. These are my people. This is the constituency that would elect me as its spokesperson. Which constituency would elect you as yours, as their spokesperson? That's for you to ask yourselves. So this was an important time for me, recognizing the tremendous political power of poetry, simply because it is a way of interrogating ready-made language. At every step, it's a way of interrogating ready-made language. And that brings me to my final point, after which perhaps I will read you a poem or two. The final point that I want to make is a realization that happened to me when I was in my late 20s, around 29. I don't want to go into the details of the experience, but it was an experience that was for me difficult to understand. It was a period when I went into a kind of phase, a week. It was just a week, but it was a week when I felt completely deserted by language. And it was a chilling experience at the time, but it marked the beginning of many things in my life, including a certain spiritual quest. But most importantly, in the context of this particular conversation that we're having, I think what it brought to me was a realization that poetry is not just about language. It's not just about sound. I talked about poetry as dance. I talked of poetry as music. I talked of poetry as craft. I talked of poetry as politics. It is all that, but it is also more. This was my first realization that poetry is also about silence. Poetry is the only verbal art that consciously embraces the. That's what rhythm is, if you think about it. It's sound and pause, sound and pause. And I began to approach the pause now with a newfound respect. I realized that that pause, all those blank spaces on a page of poetry, they are the source of a poem's life energy. Poems matter, not in spite of their pauses. Poems matter because of those pauses, because of those silences. And this, I think, changed the way in which I looked at my poetry very vitally, very fundamentally. That brings me to the close of what I wanted to say to you and share with you today. If you are ever to ask yourselves that question, why poetry? It may not happen now, it may happen later in your lives. Maybe there will come a time when you'll pick up a book of poems that matter to you, and you may still ask yourself the question, why poetry? The world will tell you, really, there's no reason for poetry. It doesn't boost the sensex. It doesn't make you sound more intelligent at dinner party conversations. It can't help you to talk about the importance of reversing the Arctic meltdown. It can't help you to talk about, you can't say, I write poetry and so I found a cure for cancer, the COVID virus. Poetry is so resolutely non-utilitarian that there are many times in your life when you might wonder whether you need it at all. And those are the times when I would say, why poetry? Poetry because in a world of information overload, poetry reminds you of the wisdom of the pause. In a world of noise, poetry reminds you of the wisdom of the murmur. In a world of dogmatism, fundism, jingoism, poetry reminds you of the deep intelligence of wonder, of unknowing, of uncertainty. And in the world of the full stop, poetry reminds you of the radical, transformative potential of the comma, the explosive possibility of the question mark. It reminds you that the question mark is not the resort of those who are cowards. The question mark is symbolic of tremendous courage. To my mind, that's why. And on that note, perhaps I should read you a couple of poems and then conclude. I thought I'd read you two poems that Dr. Priyadarshini actually mentioned were part of the syllabus the second year. I'm not sure which year that is, but I'd like to read to you a poem that is the title poem of my penultimate book. It is a book called When God is a Traveler. And I'm glad if it is in your syllabus this year. I'm very glad to hear that, because it is a poem that has meant a great deal to me. It matters to me because, let me tell you, there are many ways in which I can introduce this poem. I'm going to just choose the briefest possible introduction to it. One day I sat down and I asked myself about my name, Arundhati Subramaniam, and I thought about Subramaniam. Who is Subramaniam? Who is this god, this warrior deity that is so precious to southern India? And I thought of him at this point not as some kind. This is not a poem about the sacred in any conventional sense of the term. I was interested in the story of this god, who is a passionate, spirited, young, beautiful god who gets on his peacock and goes off on this journey around the world. He goes off in a huff, angry with his parents, a long time later to find that his answers are to be found within. And I realized then, while I was writing this poem, that some of us do have to make these journeys in order to find that the answers are sometimes just to be found exactly where we began. But we would never hear those answers if we hadn't made the journey. It reminds me of many, many stories, and many of you are familiar with these. There's the story of the prodigal son in the Bible. There's the story in Greek mythology of the Odyssey. Journeys that have to be made for a truer self-discovery to happen when God is a traveler. Trust the God back from his travels, his voice whole grain and chamomile, his wisdom mean, his peacock sweaty plumed, drowsing in the shadow. Trust him who sits wordless on park benches, fading into the dusk, his gaze emptied of vagrancy, his heart of ownership. Trust him who has seen enough. Desperate light of shopping malls, hospital rooms, manifestos, theologies, the iron taste of blood, the great craters in the middle of love. Trust him who no longer begrudges his brother his prize, his parents their partisanship. Trust him whose race is run, whose journey remains, who stands fluid-stemmed, knowing he is the tree that bears fruit, festive with sun. Trust him who recognizes you, abundant, auspicious, battle-scarred, alive, and knows from where you come. Trust the God, ready to circle the world all over again, this time for no reason at all, other than to see it through your eyes. And the last poem that I'd like to read you is from my most recent book. It's a poem called When Landscape Becomes Woman. It's from my most recent book, Love Without a Story. And as I often say when I talk of this poem, maybe some of you will remember this as well. It certainly happened more recently in your lives than it did in mine. I remember growing up just seeing my parents as the backdrop to my life. They were the foundation, the backdrop. I didn't really see them as flesh and blood individuals in their own right. I took them for granted in the way that children must, and it's completely understandable. But there comes a moment in your life when you suddenly see a parent as a sovereign, and that was my moment, which I'd like to share with you, and you probably have yours. When landscape becomes. I was 8 when I looked through a keyhole keyhole and saw my mother in room in her hibiscus silk sari, her fingers slender around a glass of iced cola. And I grew suddenly shy for not having seen her before. I knew her well, of course. Serene undulation of blue malmal, wrist serrated by thin gold bangle, the gentle convexity of mole on upper right arm, and her high arched feet better than I knew myself. And I knew her voice like running water, ice cubes in cola. But through the keyhole at the grown-up party, she was no longer geography. She seemed to know how to incline her neck, just when to sip her swirly drink, and she understood the language of lacquered nails and baritone voices and words like emergency. I could have watched her all night. And that's how I discovered that keyholes always reveal more than doorways, that a chink in the wall is all you need to tumble into a parallel universe, that mothers are women. Thank you. With that, I think I'd like to conclude this particular, my part of the session, but I'd hear from you if there are questions that you'd like to share. I hope we can make this as informal a session as possible. So if there are questions or anything you'd like to talk about, I'd be very happy to have a conversation.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you so much for your profound, engaging, and thought-provoking address, providing insights into the poetic genre by sharing your knowledge and expertise. The floor is now open for questions. May I now invite Dr. J. Saranya to moderate the question.
Ma'am, am I audible?
You are.
Before the students start with their questions, I have a question to ask you as a teacher. I think when you began your speech, I think you rendered all the literature teacher's job as a useless one when you said it's at the bottom. The poet goes to the bottom of the hierarchy. Dissecting poems in classes is not how it's intended to be. What would you think as a poet should teachers be doing in poetry classes? Which one do you think? What do you think is the real job of a teacher in a poetry class?
It's a wonderful question. And certainly I wouldn't relegate all teachers to the bottom of that trash, to that heap of trash. My issue is not with teachers per se, it's with the unimaginative teacher. So I've had some wonderful ones about whom I'm very deeply grateful. But I think this is the fundamental problem often. Is it Charanya? Is that your name?
Yes. Yes, I'm Taranya.
So I think, the question that I think we can dispense with, ideally, which perhaps has been dispensed with, but hadn't been in my time, is this question of what the poem is trying to do, or trying to achieve, or trying to say. The point is that the poem is, as I said, an integral compound of form and content, style and substance, to try in some way to splinter that essential unity in some way is to destroy the enjoyment of the poem. So if we can start, and this is something I'm still learning to do as much as you when I do poetry workshops, I try to go back to really what it is when we enjoy a poem, enjoying it, reading it aloud. For me, the poems that I have loved have been the poems that I have enjoyed reading aloud, tasting, savoring, because there are many ways in which we need to preserve the sensuousness of our excitement about poetry. If we lose the sensuousness and we only keep the meaning, as I said, the sociology, what is the poem all about, as if that's the only thing that counts, the rest of the form just becomes a sack, a receptacle for content. But if we were to stop looking at it in this kind of very utilitarian way, and if we were to look at it as this sensuous, delightful way in which language is being used, and start with that, what is it really that excites me about this poem? I've learned a great deal just by looking at poems in that way. So today, for instance, to give you an example, I often look back and I realize that I've gone through periods of gloom, of desolation. And for me, the sound of desolation is the Coleridge poem, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, those lines, alone, alone, all alone. I needed to reflect. And I think if we can encourage students to reflect on what it is that makes them, that draws them to certain lines. When I reflected on what drew me to these lines and why it was for me synonymous with desolation, I realized that it is the sound of the L, the lapping of the waves, alone, alone, all alone, alone on a wide, wide sea. There's a reason why this is the taste of forlornness for me. I think if we started encouraging students to just be more alive, more vigilant to the resources of language and the ways in which they're being used, rather than be in a hurry to impose that dreary questioning on them, I think it would perhaps be one possible key to unlocking a poem.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
That's a short answer. No longer ones are possible.
Questions? Students, you have questions?
I would like to ask a question. Hello, ma'am. This is Rachna. I'm from first year MA English. Yeah, ma'am. So I have a question for you. How do you think spirituality and language are related? Since many of your poetry inclines towards faith and religion, do you think spirituality requires a language of expression or experience?
Thank you. Is it Rachna? Is your name Rachna?
Yes, ma'am, Rachana.
Rachna. Thank you, Rachna. Thanks for your question. I'd say, Rachna, that yes, the seeker, that's been an important, having a spiritual practice has been a very important anchoring point for me. But if I were to ask myself, really, are my poems spiritual in any way? I would say I would invite you at some point, maybe not now, maybe you don't have the time, but at some point, I hope you'll actually read the poems and ask yourself where this spirituality lies. What makes something spiritual? This is a question that I would suggest that you look at. Because whenever I'm asked, are you a spiritual poet? I often say, yes, if it means writing about mothers and it means writing about cities and it means writing about orange lunchboxes, yes, I'm spiritual. But I don't necessarily write about faith. I write about faith in my prose. I write about quest in my poetry for certain. But quest has been there very, quest as in an open-ended seeking, a preoccupation with the sacred. That's certainly been there. But can I define the sacred in any easy way? Is it the sacred as divorced from orange lunch boxes, as divorced from the the L'Oreal sunsets of the city that I grew up in? Is it the sacred as separate from all this? No. No. My notion of the sacred is, it's essentially indefinable. But my notion of the sacred is anything that transforms the mundane into the magical, into the miraculous. This can happen anywhere. My favorite poem of all time is not my own. My favorite poem about this is that of the poet Arun Koletkar, for example, if I were to give you an Indian poet. I'd say Arun Koletkar's poem that you may know of. It's called The Beggar Woman. And it's a poem where he looks into the speaker in the poem, looks into the eyes of a beggar woman, and he has his darshan moment. It's a darshan. He has a kind of Vishwaroop darshan that we might call it. That's really a cosmic vision. It's not a vision that he has in any of the temples of Jejuri that he visits. That's a pilgrimage town. The whole book is named after that. He doesn't have his cosmic vision in the temples. He has it in the eyes of this beggar woman. So I think much of my work is also about breaking down these hierarchies between the sacred and the secular, where we believe one lives here and the other lives somewhere else. My own journey, and that brings me to your question about experience, my own journey experientially has been about walls between the sacred and the secular collapsing. It's not been about new walls being erected, but about walls collapsing, by which I recognized that these are not mutually exclusive. They're not separate compartments. Now I'm going to sit down and be spiritual. Now I'm going to sit down and be worldly. No, that's not how it works. We are an inextricable mix of both. And to find the sacred in the worldly, that's the journey, that's the quest.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Next question.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
We are glad to have this interaction with you, and we believe it will be very enlightening. I'm Trinita from BA English final year student, and I would like to know, many of your works have been translated in various languages. So, do you feel translated works do justice to the original poem? And as a translator yourself, we would love to know how do you maintain the heart of the work and keep the spirit of it alive?
It's a very good question. There's always that thing about what's lost in translation, and we're always saying, talking about all the losses. But things are gained in translation too. And I think I like to focus on what we do gain. When I've translated other poets, and for many years, I edited a website that was entirely devoted to translations of contemporary Indian poets from multiple Indian languages. So, and this is called the Poetry International Web. I just want to invite those of you who haven't looked at it, do take a look at the India domain of the Poetry International Web. You'll find several Indian poets, contemporary poets, in multiple Indian languages right there. And I'd say to you that, yes, it's true. It's possible that not everything has been adequately translated. Perhaps some of it is untranslatable. Perhaps we never find the person who's perfectly poised to understand source language and target language with the same precision, the same exactitude. Maybe it's difficult to find. But the journey is worth it because, and this is something I found to be true, that when I put together this book of translations of Bhakti poetry, for instance, Eating God, I realized that part of the endeavor was just to invite the reader to read further. And if a book of translations can do that, I think it has achieved a great deal. Much better to have a translation than never know that these poets existed. Growing up, I would never have known, never been able to read the work of Rilke, the work of Neruda, the work of all the Russian poets whom I've loved. Never, had it not been for translation. So I would never have been able to read Hafiz and Rumi. I would never have been able to read the poets of this very subcontinent had it not been for translation. So translation is a great key. It's a key that opens another world. Sometimes there are some translators I've met who actually believe that their translations are better than the original. I don't quite judge that. But there have been some magnificent translations, haven't there? And thank God for them. And I think even when the translation is not everything that we would want it to be, it has achieved its function if it invites you into the poetic universe of a particular poet. To me, it's worth it then. My own Italian translator is Andrea Sirotti, whom I trust immensely, simply because whenever he wrote to me about some of the poems that he was translating of mine, he always knew the right question to ask. And I knew from the quality of his questions that he'd really engaged with the poem. Not what the poem was trying to say, but with the actual choices that the poem was making on the level of word, on the level of tense, on the level of line length. And so I think these are the ways in which you know whether a translator has really understood your work or not. But I'd say thank God for translations. That's the bottom line as far as I'm concerned. That's our only way to understand each other and to be invited into each other's worlds.
Yes, ma'am, totally. Thank you.
Next question. Anybody has a question?
Hello, ma'am.
Hello.
Hi, my name is Arundhati,
Oh,
and yeah, I know it was a bit of a surprise when yeah. So I have a doubt of my own when it comes to your work in women who only wear themselves. Could you tell me whose story resonated with you the most, and if there was a story you wanted to add?
Arundhati, that's a good question. And this is my doppelganger moment, right? Seeing you there at the other end with the same name. I would say there are many. Which story resonated the most? It's very difficult. You know, many years ago, I've had many friends of mine who were who were theater. I've had close friends who've been theater directors and film directors, and every time I ask any of them, you know, who is the character, which is the actor who's most dear to you in a film or in a play, they would always say, as soon as I look through that camera, or as soon as I don my director's hat, they're all equal. Each one of those four women, each one of those accounts, if I told you the care that went into deciding where each of them would be placed in the trajectory of the book. Uh, if I were to tell you what went into every sentence that I used to talk about them, or every pause that I interjected into those conversations, I'd say a lot of thought, a lot of care, a lot of tenderness went into that. And the reason for that is that all of them, in very different ways, are significant to me. But I will say that the first two portraits were the reasons why I wrote the book. Annapurni Amma and the second portrait, Balarishi. These were the two conversations I had, which I'd recorded, and I felt they were just waiting to be shared. But I knew that that alone would not make a book. And so I started thinking about what I would add. And I said, as I thought about it, I said, I happen to know two extraordinary women, and they're waiting to be written about too. And so I included them. And in many ways now I realize that for many readers, certainly, Ma Karpuri, because I happen to know her very well, she's the last portrait in the book. In many ways, that has been the most compelling portrait for some readers because there's a great intimacy in that portrait. So it's different for different readers. For me, I'd say all of them. Annapurni Amma, Bada Rishi, Lata, Mani, and Ma Karpuri, each of them are very, very precious to me as subjects in that narrative. If I wanted to write about more, I really wouldn't know who to write about, but there are so many, Arundhati. There are so many. There are so many women, actually very well-known women, whom I didn't put in there because I wanted this to be about unknown women. But the point of this book was to remind us, really, of the fact that there are so many extraordinary unsung women that we know, each one of us. Extraordinary for different reasons. These are women who happen to be spiritual travelers, but you will know many extraordinary women in your life for different reasons, extraordinary for different reasons. I just hope that a book of this kind in some way can empower us to just trust in the importance of these women. You know, often we don't allow ourselves to acknowledge sufficiently some of these exceptional beings who are right around us, because we're encouraged to believe that the only people who count are those whom the media tells us are important, or whom social media tells us are important. But we're actually sitting right beside some incredible human beings. It's time to sit down and archive them in whatever way you choose. It could be in a poem, it could be in prose, it could be in an essay, in whatever way you choose. But I think doing that in some way actually touches a very deep part of the self, a part of the self that has for far too long felt unacknowledged, felt unheard. And if there's any part of you that feels unheard, talking about another person, giving them that simple act of attention, honoring them with that act of attention, is a way of honoring yourself. So that would be my answer to your question.
That was a really nice answer, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Ma'am, could you hear us?
Yes, now I can.
Yeah. Sorry, ma'am, there was a technical glitch.
No
Thank
problem.
you so much for patiently answering our questions. And thank you, Dr. Saranya, for moderating the session. May I now request Madam Yanam, Assistant Professor, Self-Supporting, to deliver the thanking note.
Good afternoon. It's indeed my honor to mark the closure of this inaugural of Athena 2021 with this note of gratitude. On this occasion, let me pay my tributes to our revered founder, Sri V.L. Ethiraj, whose vision and mission has embarked on an academic journey which has traversed across several decades, educating. May the sparkle of his memory illumine the path of each one of us, Ethirajians, in such measures as we uphold on behalf of the Department of English, both aided and self-supporting. Let me place on record my sincere and heartfelt thanks to the eminent invitee of the day, poet, writer, critic, translator, journalist, curator, Sahitya Academy awardee, Ms. Arundhati Subramaniam, for having readily accommodated her dates at our request. Thank you very much, ma'am, for rising up to the occasion with your genial presence and addressing and sharing your reflections on poetry as a verbal music, as a verbal dance, a craft, and a kind of politics. It's definitely a fresh perspective you've given us to ponder about. And thank you, ma'am, for sparing your time for that interactive session with our students. Let me also extend my deep sense of gratitude to the management and Chairperson Dr. Chandradevi Tanikachalam for ensuring and providing us with a feasible workspace. We are equally grateful to our respected principal, Dr. S. Kodai, and vice principals of both aided and self-supporting, Dr. Usha Rani and Dr. Usha Priya, for being ever supportive in all our endeavors. Our thanks are also due to our heads of the department, both aided and self-supporting, Dr. J. Mangayar Karasi and Ms. K. Yashoda, and the faculty members of the Department of English for extending all possible help and inputs whenever required. Ms. Anupriya Babu, Association Secretary Aided, Ms. Ashwini Rajnikant, Association Secretary, Self-Supporting, Ms. M.V. Amutali, Joint Cultural Secretary Aided, Ms. S. Dashini, Joint Cultural Secretary Aided, and Ms. G. Ramya, Joint Cultural Secretary Self-Supporting, of Athena 2021-22. Thank you very much, girls, for your utmost cooperation and willingness which you have displayed throughout. Ms. Roshna, in design and my own behalf, my co-faculty association in charges of the aided department, Taranya, my final word of thanks goes to our most respected retired teachers, alumna, and our dear students who have joined on this digital platform. Thank you. Thank you, one and all.
On behalf of the department, I thank you all for making time to join us here this morning. It's been a pleasure to host this event, and I wish you all a pleasant day. College song.
முன்னேறுவோம் உள்ள பரிவும் ஓங்கும் செல்வ நிதியமும் மழை திறந்த வெள்ளம் போல மனமு வந்து நல்கினார் கல்வி கோயில் வாழ்வுடனே நிறுவினார் கொடைவள நாம் எத்திராஜன் கொள்கை வழி செல்குவோம் ஏறுவோம் முன்னேறுவோம் பாட்டுடனே அறிவியலும் பல கலையும் பயிலுவோம் நாட்டினிலே அறத்தை காக்க நல்லொழுக்கம் போடுவோம் ஏட்டினிலே கற்ற கல்வி என்றும் எங்கள் நெஞ்சினில் கூட்டும் தெய்வ பக்தியோடு தேச பக்தி ஓங்கவே ஏறுவோம் முன்னேறுவோம் வயது தெய்வ தீபமாக ஒளிரும் கல்வி சுடரினில் முயன்று தேடி காணவே முன் வைத்த கல்வி வாங்கினோம் முயன்று தேடி காணவே முன் வைத்த கல்வி வாங்கினோம் முயன்று தேடி காணவே முன் வைத்த கல்வி வாங்கினோம் ஏறுவோம் முன்னேறுவோம் என்றுமே முன்னேறுவோம் எங்கள் எதிராஜ் கல்லூரி ஏற்ற வாழ்வில் தேறுவோம் ஏறுவோம் ஏறுவோம் முன்னேறுவோம் ஏறுவோம் 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 முன்னேறுவோம் ஏறுவோம் 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 முன்னேறுவோம் முன்னேறுவோம்.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you all. God bless.